In the history of American finance, there have been frauds, there have been scandals, there have been collapses that shook the entire country. No, but there has never been anything like Bernie Madoff. Not even close. Because Bernie Madoff did not just steal money, he stole trust. He stole futures. He stole the life savings of widows, retirees, charities, and Holocaust survivors. He stole from his closest friends. He stole from people who had known him for 40 years. And he did it all while smiling, while shaking hands. While being celebrated as one of the greatest financial minds in American history, he stole $65 billion. And for decades, absolutely nobody knew. Imagine handing your life savings to someone you trusted completely. Someone your father trusted. Someone your grandfather trusted. A man so respected, so established, so deeply woven into the fabric of American finance that questioning him felt almost offensive. And then one morning you pick up your phone and you learn that every single dollar you gave him is gone. Not lost, not invested badly, stolen, deliberately, methodically, for decades. That is what happened to thousands of real people. Doctors, teachers, retirees, entire Jewish community organizations, charities that fed the poor and sheltered the sick, all of it gone, because one man decided that the rules simply did not apply to him. This is the story of Bernard Lawrence Madoff, the greatest con artist in the history of human civilization. Bernard Madoff was born on April 29, 1938, in Queens, New York. He grew up in a modest Jewish family in Laurelton, a quiet middle-class neighborhood where nobody was rich and everybody knew everybody. His father, Ralph, worked various jobs. His mother, Sylvia, at one point actually registered as a broker-dealer with the Securities and Exchange Commission, though her firm was eventually dissolved. This small detail would later seem almost poetic. The family that raised the greatest securities fraudster in history had its own complicated relationship with financial regulation from the very beginning. Young Bernie was not a spectacular student. He was not the kind of child that teachers remembered as obviously destined for greatness. But he had something that no classroom could teach. He had an extraordinary ability to make people feel comfortable, to make people feel seen, to make people feel that he genuinely cared about them. He was warm, he was charming, he remembered names, birthdays, details. He made you feel, when you were talking to him, like you were the most important person in the room. This gift, this social intelligence, would eventually become the most dangerous weapon in the history of American finance. Madoff attended Hofstra University on Long Island, graduating in 1960 with a degree in political science. He briefly enrolled in law school, but dropped out almost immediately. He had already decided what he wanted to do. In 1960, at just 22 years old, using $5,000 he had saved from working as a lifeguard and installing sprinkler systems, Bernard Madoff founded Bernard L. Madoff Investment Securities. $5,000. That was the seed of what would become a $65 billion fraud. In those early years, Madoff's firm was genuinely legitimate, operated as a market maker, meaning he helped match buyers and sellers of stocks, earning a small spread on each transaction. It was unglamorous work, especially compared to the big established Wall Street firms that dominated the industry. Madoff was an outsider. He knew it. He resented it deeply. The old guard of Wall Street. The white shoe firms with their Ivy League pedigrees and their exclusive clubs, they looked down on people like Bernie Madoff, and Bernie Madoff looked back at them and decided he would beat them at their own game. And for a while, he genuinely did. Madoff became one of the pioneers of electronic trading, helping to develop and champion the systems that would eventually become the Nasdaq Stock Exchange. This was real innovation, real contribution. By the 1980s and 1990s, Madoff's legitimate trading operation was one of the largest and most respected market makers in the United States. He served as chairman of Nasdaq. He was invited to advise the Securities and Exchange Commission on market structure. He was, by any objective measure, a genuine titan of Wall Street. Self-made man who had built something extraordinary from almost nothing. But somewhere along the way, that was not enough. The exact moment when Bernie Madoff crossed from legitimate businessman to criminal mastermind is something that even Madoff himself gave conflicting accounts of. In his own confession, he claimed the fraud began in the early 1990s, during a recession, when his investment advisory business struggled to deliver the consistent returns he had promised clients. But federal investigators and many researchers believe the fraud began much earlier. It's possibly as far back as the 1970s or even the 1960s. The truth may be that there was never a single moment of crossing, that the line was blurred so gradually, so incrementally, that Madoff rationalized each small step until the entire structure of his investment advisory business was built on nothing but fiction. Here's how the fraud actually worked. Madoff ran two completely separate businesses inside Bernard L. Madoff Investment Securities. The first was the legitimate trading operation, the market-making business that was real, that employed real people, that traded real stocks. This was the public face of the firm, the part that regulators saw, the part that gave Madoff his reputation and his credibility. The second was the investment advisory business, the part where wealthy individuals and institutions gave Madoff their money to invest on their behalf. This second business was the fraud. It was from top to bottom, a Ponzi scheme of almost incomprehensible scale. A Ponzi scheme works on a simple and devastating principle. You promise investors extraordinary returns. Instead of actually investing their money, you keep it. When investors want to withdraw their profits, you pay them using money from new investors. As long as new money keeps coming in faster than old money goes out, the scheme continues. The moment it cannot, the entire structure collapses instantly. Charles Ponzi ran his version of this scheme in 1920 and stole around $20 million before it fell apart. Bernie Madoff ran his version for somewhere between 17 and 40 years and stole $65 billion. He did not just refine the Ponzi scheme, he perfected it. What made Madoff's fraud so brilliantly constructed was the way he manufactured credibility at every single level. He did not promise outrageous returns that would immediately raise suspicion. He promised consistent, modest, almost boring returns. While other investment managers were promising to make you rich overnight, Madoff's accounts showed returns of roughly 10 to 12% per year, year after year after year, regardless of what the broader market was doing. When the stock market crashed, Madoff's clients still made money. When other funds collapsed, Madoff's clients still made money. The consistency itself should have been a screaming alarm. In the real world, no legitimate investment strategy produces perfectly smooth returns through every market condition. But investors did not see a red flag. They saw safety. They saw genius. They saw a man who had somehow figured out how to defeat the fundamental uncertainty of financial markets. The strategy Madoff claimed to use was called a split-strike conversion. It involved buying a basket of stocks from the S&P 100 index, while simultaneously using options contracts to limit downside risk. It sounded sophisticated enough to be credible, but not so exotic that it seemed dangerous. When sophisticated investors and mathematicians tried to actually analyze whether this strategy could produce the returns Madoff was claiming, the math simply did not work. The options market was not large enough to accommodate the positions Madoff would have needed to take, given the size of his fund. It was mathematically impossible. But most investors never looked that closely. They trusted Bernie. And Bernie's social genius was deployed at every opportunity to ensure that trust never wavered. He was extraordinarily selective about who he allowed to invest with him. He did not advertise. There was no website, no brochure, no sales pitch. You had to be introduced. You had to be recommended by someone already inside the circle. This exclusivity was genius, because exclusivity creates desire. People who were invited to invest with Madoff felt privileged. They felt chosen. Turning down the opportunity felt almost insulting to the person who had vouched for you. And once you were in, you were part of something, a community, an inner circle of people who had access to something others could not get. The social dimension of the fraud was as important as the financial one. Madoff built his client base primarily, though not exclusively, through the Jewish community in New York, Palm Beach, and beyond. He was a fixture at country clubs frequented by wealthy Jewish families. He gave generously to Jewish charities and sat on the boards of Jewish cultural institutions. He was trusted not just as a financial advisor, but as a community pillar, a mensch, a man of integrity. And so when he recommended that a charitable foundation move its endowment into his fund, foundation's directors did not hire independent analysts to verify his returns. They trusted him the way you trust family. This made the eventual betrayal not just a financial catastrophe, but a deeply personal and communal wound that went far beyond money. Among Madoff's victims were some of the most prominent names in American Jewish philanthropy. Elie Wiesel, the Nobel Prize-winning Holocaust survivor and author, lost his entire personal fortune and the entire endowment of his foundation. Hadassah, the largest Jewish women's organization in America, lost around $90 million. Steven Spielberg's Wunderkinder Foundation lost money. The list went on and on, a who's who of Jewish American philanthropy and culture, all devastated by the man they had trusted most. And through all of it, for all those years, Bernie Madoff showed up to charity galas, sat on regulatory advisory boards, attended synagogue, played golf in Palm Beach, and smiled. He was not visibly stressed. He was not drinking too much or behaving erratically. He was calm, composed, and charming, right up until the very end. The performance of normalcy he maintained for decades was itself a kind of staggering achievement, though an entirely evil one. But there was someone who knew. Someone who had been screaming into the void for years, filing report after report, sending letter after letter, and being completely ignored by the very regulators whose job it was to listen. His name was Harry Markopolos. Markopolos was a financial analyst and fraud investigator who first encountered Madoff's reported returns in 1999 when his own firm asked him to reverse engineer Madoff's strategy so they could replicate it. Markopolos sat down with Madoff's numbers and within 4 hours concluded that the returns were mathematically impossible. He said later that it took him 4 minutes to know something was wrong and for hours to prove it beyond any doubt. He brought his findings to the Boston office of the Securities and Exchange Commission in 2000. They did nothing. He submitted a more detailed report in 2001. They did nothing. He filed again in 2005 with a 30-page document titled, "The World's Largest Hedge Fund is a Fraud." He named Madoff directly. He laid out the mathematics precisely. He even suggested that the SEC consider the possibility that Madoff was front-running, using his knowledge of client orders to trade ahead of them, which would be slightly less catastrophic than a full Ponzi scheme. The SEC investigated briefly and found nothing, because they did not know what they were looking for. Because Madoff was too respected, too connected, too unthinkable as a criminal. And because the SEC investigators at the time lacked the mathematical sophistication to understand what Markopolos was showing them. Markopolos would later testify before Congress that he had been terrified for his own safety during those years, that he had believed Madoff had connections to organized crime, that he had genuinely feared what might happen if Madoff discovered someone was investigating him. He kept a gun in his home. He varied his daily routines, told his wife that if anything happened to him, she should go to the authorities immediately. All of this while the SEC filed Markopolos' reports and moved on to other things. The fraud ended not because of regulatory action and not because of investigative journalism. It ended because of the 2008 financial crisis. When the global financial system collapsed in the fall of 2008, investors everywhere panicked and rushed to withdraw their money from every fund they could reach. Madoff's investors were no different. In the weeks following the crash, redemption requests poured into Madoff's office, totaling approximately $7 billion. And for the first time in the history of his scheme, Bernie Madoff could not cover them. The money was not there. It had never been there. After decades of taking in new money and paying out old money in a perfectly calibrated balance, the scale had finally tipped beyond recovery. On December 10, 2008, Bernard Madoff called his two sons, Mark and Andrew, who'd both worked at the legitimate trading side of the firm, into his apartment. What he told them in that conversation would destroy his family as completely as his fraud had destroyed his clients. He confessed everything. He told them the investment advisory business was a fraud, that it had always been a fraud, that there was no money, that he was finished. Mark and Andrew Madoff did not protect their father. The following morning, December 11, 2008, they called a lawyer, and that lawyer called the FBI. Within hours, federal agents arrived at Madoff's Upper East Side apartment. An agent asked him if there was an innocent explanation for what his sons had described. Madoff looked at the agent and said simply, "There is no innocent explanation." He was arrested on the spot. The scale of what investigators found when they began examining Madoff's records was almost beyond comprehension. The final account statements sent to clients showed balances totaling $65 billion. The actual amount of cash that had been invested over the years and then stolen was approximately $17 billion. The remaining $48 billion represented decades of fictional profits that existed only on paper. In statements that Madoff's back office team had been fabricating by hand, literally printing out fake trading confirmations and account. Statements for clients who never questioned them because the numbers always looked exactly right. Madoff pleaded guilty on March 12, 2009 to 11 federal felonies, including securities fraud, wire fraud, mail fraud, money laundering, and making false statements. He did not go to trial. He offered no defense. He stood in federal court and said, "I am actually grateful for this opportunity to publicly say how deeply sorry I am to all of my victims." Whether that apology was genuine, whether Bernie Madoff felt actual remorse, or simply understood that remorse was the correct performance for the moment, is something only he ever truly knew. On June 29, 2009, he was sentenced to 150 years in federal prison. He was 71 years old. The judge called the fraud unprecedented and staggering. The victims in the courtroom applauded, but the human cost of Madoff's fraud went beyond any number that could be written in a court document. Mark Madoff, Bernie's older son, who had turned his father into the FBI, who had cooperated fully with investigators, who maintained until his death that he had known nothing about the fraud, hanged himself on December 11, 2010, exactly 2 years to the day after his father's arrest. He was 46 years old. He left behind a wife and 4 children. Andrew Madoff, the younger son, developed a rare form of cancer. He had been in remission before his father's arrest. After the arrest, the cancer returned. Andrew Madoff died in September 2014 at the age of 48. He spent his final years speaking publicly about the destruction his father had caused, including to his own family. Ruth Madoff, Bernie's wife of 50 years, who maintained that she too had known nothing about the fraud, was left nearly destitute. She was allowed to keep $2.5 million out of the hundreds of millions she and her husband had appeared to accumulate. She lived out her remaining years in obscurity, estranged from much of the world that had once celebrated her family. Bernie Madoff spent his final years at the Butner Federal Correctional Complex in North Carolina. He gave occasional interviews, expressed what appeared to be genuine remorse for certain things, particularly for the suffering of his sons. He applied multiple times for compassionate release, citing kidney disease and other serious health conditions. His requests were denied. On April 14, 2021, Bernard Lawrence Madoff died in federal prison at the age of 82. He had served 12 years of his 150-year sentence. He died as he had lived for decades, behind a carefully constructed wall that kept the full truth of who he was just out of reach. The victims of Bernie Madoff's fraud spent years fighting through the bankruptcy process to recover whatever could be recovered. Irving Picard, the court-appointed trustee responsible for recovering assets, pursued legal claims across multiple continents for over a decade. By 2021, his office had recovered and distributed approximately $14 billion to victims. An extraordinary achievement in the context of fraud recovery, but still billions short of what had been stolen. Some victims recovered pennies on the dollar, but others, particularly those who had withdrawn profits over the years before the collapse, covered nothing and faced clawback suits demanding they return money they had already spent. Money they had believed was legitimately theirs. The Securities and Exchange Commission conducted a devastating internal review of its own failures in the Madoff case. The review found that the agency had received 6 substantive complaints about Madoff over 16 years and had failed to conduct a single competent examination of his operation. Investigators who looked into the complaints lacked the expertise to understand what they were seeing. Senior officials were reluctant to pursue cases against figures as prominent and connected as Madoff. The culture of the agency prioritized the avoidance of embarrassment over the aggressive pursuit of fraud. The review was published in full and remains one of the most damning self-assessments ever produced by a federal regulatory agency. Congress held extensive hearings. New regulations were passed. Resources were directed toward improving the SEC's analytical capabilities. And Harry Markopolos, the man who had spent 9 years trying to get someone to listen, was finally recognized as one of the most important whistleblowers in the history of American financial regulation. He received numerous awards, wrote a book, testified before Congress with the quiet fury of a man who had watched a preventable catastrophe unfold in slow motion, while everyone with the power to stop it looked the other way. So what does the story of Bernie Madoff ultimately mean? It means that trust, the most fundamental currency in any human relationship, can be weaponized. That the same qualities that make someone beloved, warmth, consistency, reputation, community membership, can be deployed with cold deliberation to make theft invisible. It means that complexity and prestige are not the same as integrity, and that the people most celebrated by an institution are not necessarily the people that institutions should trust most completely. It means that when one person raises a credible, specific, mathematically rigorous alarm about something that seems impossible, and everyone in authority dismisses that alarm because acting on it would be uncomfortable, and because the alternative seems unthinkable. The unthinkable is often exactly what is happening, and it means something else, something harder to say, but important to name. Bernie Madoff stole from people who trusted him precisely because they felt safe with him. The country club, the community, the shared identity. He understood that trust is most complete and most blind when it flows through networks of belonging. When to question someone feels like questioning your own people, he exploited that belonging with total ruthlessness. And in doing so, he did not just steal money. He poisoned something deeper, made people afraid to trust the communities that had always protected them. It's that particular damage. The damage to the fabric of how people relate to one another and what they owe each other is the one that no bankruptcy trustee can ever fully repair. $65 billion, thousands of victims, decades of lies, 2 sons dead, a wife erased, a man who went to his grave in a federal prison. Having lived most of his life celebrated and beloved, is never fully reckoning in public with the totality of what he had chosen to become. This has been American Empires. If this story stayed with you the way it stayed with me, you already know what to do. Subscribe, because the next empire we explore is one that will genuinely shock you. We are going inside Theranos. It's a Silicon Valley startup that claimed to have revolutionized medicine with a technology that never actually worked. The story of Elizabeth Holmes, the youngest female billionaire in American history, and how she convinced the most powerful people in the world to believe in something that was never real. That episode is coming very soon. Till then, remember, empires rise, empires fall. And the truth, no matter how long it takes, always survives.